Welcome to everybody. This is our third Digital Fortress session of 2024. We're here to provide some tips and some based on real experiences across cyber risk. I've got a few housekeeping things just to go through, so I'll do that now. If you've got questions, please put them into the Q&A function down at the bottom. If we don't address them through the course of this webinar, then we'll address them at the end. If you've got technical difficulties, you can put them in the chat function. And if you want to contact speakers directly, then you can click on the resources tab down below and you'll be taken to their bios and contact details. There'll be a recording that will go out to everybody that has signed up with contact details. Okay, so in today's session, we'll delve into the convergence of cyber security and physical security. And this is being driven by an increased interconnectivity of security, the complex threat landscape, and the regulatory pressures that are facing us. There's also an overwhelming desire across tech and all of business to optimize resources. We'll explore how this integration of these two traditionally separated domains is happening and the implications on all of us. So we look forward to an informative and engaging session. I guess I should start with an introduction of myself. So I'm John Root. I'm head of cybersecurity at Mishcon, working with and supported by the wider cyber risk and complex investigations team. And I rely heavily on the expertise from a dynamic duo such as Kizzy and Francisco, apologies. Francisco, why don't you go first?
Sure. My name is Francisco Sanches, and I'm the Cyber Risk Director within Mishcon Cyber Risk and Complex Investigations team.
Kizzy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, John. So I'm Kizzy Augustine. I head up our health and safety practice here at Mishcon. I split my time between advisory and reactive work, generally advising companies and individuals on the physical and perhaps not so physical makeup of health and safety and regulatory law. And I know lots about regulatory pressures, so no doubt we'll talk about that today.
Okay, well, we'll start with the first topic, obviously. So as security needs evolve, the integration of security, physical and cyber, is becoming more apparent. We've got a blurring of lines between these two, between digital assets and physical assets, and organizations must adapt, and we must span both of these areas. Given this context, are the roles truly coming together? Are the professions truly coming together? Francisco, what's your take on this?
Sure. So we're discussing about if the physical security and the cyber security professions are truly coming together. Well, in a short answer, yes. So the physical security and the cyber security professions are increasingly coming together because organizations recognize there's a need for a more integrated approach to security. And I would list that potentially the main factors that contribute to this convergence are a blurring of boundaries because of the prevalence of Internet of Things and operational technology devices. This essentially means that the attack surface has rapidly expanded as these systems connect the digital and the physical domains. Another one would be the shared threats. So what I mean by that is that both physical and cyber threats can impact an organization's overall security posture. And that means they need a coordinated prevention and reaction to those common shared threats. Another factor would be risk management approaches. More and more organizations are looking or moving towards holistic risk management strategies that would consider all aspects of security, and these tend to be separated across different silos. And organizations are looking to ways of merging them to provide better, more holistic approaches to it, as I mentioned. The other aspect is more and more cross-training and collaborations. initiatives. They want to ensure that both the physical security personnel understand the cybersecurity principles and vice versa. So they're doing them in collaboration. From the cybersecurity space in particular, just think about the very well-known red team exercises that involve a lot of trying to breach the cybersecurity of whatever organization they're testing to get to the cybersecurity space of that organization, or a way of avoiding that space. That completely merges those two aspects really well. And then last but not the least, we have the regulatory compliance in the new law. So we have new regulations and legal requirements that increasingly emphasize on the need for organizations to protect both the physical and the digital assets. And I think Kizzy is probably a better place to comment on this. Kizzy?
Well, I mean, I can certainly add my 2 pence in terms of the merger or intersectionality between safety and security. And I think what we've seen in recent years is there is an ongoing relationship between safety and security. Needless to say, when you look at physical security and cyber, that's also evolved as well. I think what we're seeing is weaknesses in security generally create increased risks for businesses, which in turn will create almost a decrease in the safety element that you are able to manage and promote. So as a result, we're seeing safety as a concept and security as a concept directly proportional to each other, but in some way they're inversely proportional to risk. And the demonstration of that, I say kind of the actual demonstration of that, has been a couple of bits of legislation that have developed over the last couple of years. Perfect example, Building Safety Act, which was created as a result of a kind of outcry to the Grenfell Tower fire. And it created a lot of, I'd say, onerous responsibilities on the colloquial duty holder. And alongside that came the duty to ensure that you had a risk assessment process, which is generally done electronically for various reasons, and information being stored about the life cycle of a building and the measures and mitigation that is being implemented in respect of the safety of relevant buildings. And maybe even more directly relevant is the introduction, hopefully anticipated introduction, of Martin's Law, which, you know, for us in the safety world is now talking about physical security, risk and counterterrorism. And the bill that's going through Parliament at the moment is the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, which is all about the physical safety of staff, occupants and the public. And again, that's in response to the Manchester bombing and looking at what can be done to deal with physical security and how the information about your processes and management of risk is done. And generally it's being done electronically now.
Thank you. Well, it sounds like a converged and coordinated approach is absolutely essential. And you mentioned new laws coming in. So, you know, I'll start by saying Copilot told me. Okay, so the evolution of health and safety responsibilities apparently began back with the Factories Act in 1833, and then you know, laws have developed, 1974, the next, and then 1992, then again in 2002, and then COVID hit. And, you know, that highlighted the importance of public health measures and being prepared. So you mentioned recent changes that are kind of expanding the scope and increasing responsibilities of health and safety roles, incorporating environmental protection and sustainability amongst others. So what's your view on the role of the mega health and safety role? That I mean, I saw there was a Director of Environment, Health, Safety, Security and Sustainability role, or it was described as EHSSSSSSS, or I can't count the number of S's. So, Kizzy, what's your take?
It's a real thing, John. It's a real thing. So, I mean, the idea of the development of health and safety, and I hope that maybe the cyber world can take some comfort or at least reassurance on the direction of travel that we've certainly taken. Hopefully, not from 1833, but there's been a lot of development in recent years in terms of what we call duty holders, but essentially it's those professionals that are the ones that are tasked with the operational side of managing risk. So we laugh about the acronyms or the kind of titles that are being given to directors or managers responsible for safety and security. But it's a real thing. And I remember a couple of years ago, we held a conference in Berlin, and all we were talking about was straight health and safety. And anyone else wanted to talk about was ESG and sustainability and security. And they said the reason they wanted to talk about those risks were because their job titles were changing. And it was all because these new risks were arising, and the businesses wanted, instead to bring in experts outside, they wanted their existing safety professionals to take on board those roles because they already had an appreciation of what good risk mitigation looked like. So you are getting these directors and managers who are being given the title environment, health, safety, security, quality assurance, sustainability, SSSSS. But this is a real practical issue for individuals. I don't know how any professional without the necessary support, and often they don't have necessary support because of time and resource or lack of time and resource, how do they actually fulfill their role? And therefore, if they can't fulfill their role, they're really at risk of potential not only liability for the organization and the part that they might play within that, but personal liability. So while all of these roles are adapting to the development of society and new risk and appreciation of risk, I think we need to start thinking where this might go next. And I think there is more development to be had. Certainly in health and safety, we're seeing an additional role now being thought about, not even just physical cyber security, but also what this does from a mental health, well-being issue, and these kind of ideas of non-tangible safety and security. So I think that's where we're going to see this develop next. But at the moment, certainly professionals are worried about whether or not they can fulfill their roles suitably.
So it sounds like there's a lot of different responsibilities there. It sounds like there's a lot of support that's really needed. We've got, as you described, and the real world is not all of the roles are combined, and not in all organizations. We have cyber roles, physical security roles, health and safety roles, and they all have security aspects in them. But are these really the same roles with different languages, or not? Who would like to start?
I mean, this may be more Francisco's bag, but I think for what it's worth, I don't think there's a change of roles, and I don't think we're just getting lots of these different roles working in silos. I do think we are moving towards a time where you have got cybersecurity professionals working alongside health and safety, sustainability, environmental professionals within organizations. So there's much more collaboration and communication, which is the key. Very similar risk issues, and therefore it makes sense to collaborate. But I think what we're seeing more of is the use of cyber tools as a way of achieving compliance. Certainly in my world, there's much more reliance on the internet, on automation, on data, and the use of computer-related solutions to meet regulatory obligations. So if that's the case, then it makes more sense for these different worlds to come together and actually work together to mitigate risk as a whole. I don't know. What do you think, Francisco?
I agree with what you said. I would just add that I think in ANSYS, and this already happens, but a bit more informal. So we have a convergence of security functions. And what I mean by this, what needs to happen from my perspective, is that we need to move from this informal collaboration that might already happen in some organizations and effectively establish formal collaboration between these previously disjoint security functions. So there must be mechanisms in the future, areas that they will communicate and work amongst, be it sharing information, doing joint exercises, being joint risk management practices, different areas that need to be thought about what makes sense for each organization to consider. But essentially, it needs to move in a more formal way to ensure that conversion happens among functions, and less about making all into one big role. So I don't see that happening anytime soon.
So we've mentioned a couple of times the sort of recent changes in the EU and US on a legal basis. Francisco, what's your take on what's happening around the world?
Sure. So if I look at US and EU as the leaders typically in this space coming up with new legislations that will drive the rest of the world to then either adopt or come up with their own, we see a lot of focus. So for instance, the US government, it was already, I believe, back in 2022, I think, create a working group dedicated to specifically the cyber physical resilience, and that their intention is to find new approaches to this problem, and they intend to consult experts from across public, private sectors, and academia. So they're really trying to bring everyone together and think about how to properly address this area. On the US as well, you have the National Cybersecurity Strategy and the upcoming Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill that will also have impacts on this space. When we move to the European Union, more recently, probably on everyone's mind, the NIS2 directive, which seeks to boost the cyber and physical resilience of European Union critical entities and networks, and they expanded basically the sectors and type of entities that fall under its scope. A different kind of legislation, but also with a very interesting impact, would be the European Union Cyber Resilience Act that effectively sets out cybersecurity requirements for a range of hardware and software products placed on the EU market, and that includes smart speakers, games, and operating systems. And it will be very interesting to see the impacts that will have on how things change.
So Francisco and I start with a cybersecurity focus. Kizzy, what's your take on the recent changes and with a different angle on it?
I think without sort of going into lots of detail about the legislation, because there has been quite a lot in safety and security over the last few years. I've already mentioned a couple. So building safety, focus on sort of health and safety and what that is in its widest context, and also new legislation such as Martin's Law, the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, which is focused on security issues relating to premises and events. It's all about reducing the likelihood of physical harm in the event of a terrorist attack. So again, that looks at your security function and making sure that public premises and events are prepared. It's all about this idea of preparedness. And hopefully I can maybe throw in some words that have come out of the new legislation, such as Martin's Law, such as the Online Safety Act, such as the AI legislation that's come out. We find that common threads are corporate and individual liability, the introduction of concepts of responsibility, accountability, competence being given some form of a kind of legal definition and what that looks like in our world. It's people who have the necessary skills, knowledge, experience, and also now for the first time introducing culture into the equation. So there's lots of legislation surrounding safety, security, risk, and harm. But I think the concepts that we're seeing running throughout are identifying some level of corporate responsibility, but also personal accountability, which is some of the things that we're advising on.
It feels like that's a constant stream of new legislation. Is that a good thing, a bad thing, or, what do you think?
Well, as a lawyer, I'd probably say it's a good thing. But I think as a person and putting myself in the shoes of duty holders, I think there's a lot of legislation out there, certainly in the UK. Some may say too much legislation. Some of the problems that we've come up against in terms of advising clients is that there's so much confusion around who does what when and what piece of legislation applies to our particular building or our particular activities or our function. So what do we have to look at? Do we look at legislation? Do we look at regulation? How important is guidance? I think in the UK, there are really, really good intentions to solve problems and be sort of real fixers here. But I think maybe our first port of call should have been and should still be to make better use of the kind of legal tools that we have already. One thing that's maybe influenced that has been public perception and public pressure. If you think about the public response to Grenfell, which was absolutely horrific, there was a demand for more legislation. If we then saw the kind of fallout from the use of data and computers and the misuse of computers and the internet, then you have, you know, the Online Safety Act, which took a while to get through, and had its own difficulties. But again, I think public perception and public pressure has played a part in driving a stream of legislation and new guidance.
Yeah, I would add that, and picking up on Kizzy's previous words, the fact that the new legislation focus on corporate and individual liability and the notion of competence, I think this forces, and that's positive, organizations to reflect on who is responsible for this within our organizations. Are we just giving the label to someone or not? Is that person competent to deliver on those areas or not? So it forces the bar on those areas, and I see that as a positive one. The negative aspect for me is, as Kizzy is saying, too many things coming from two different sides, and then that means that it feels like we need some harmonization, simplification of all the different regulations, the different aspects, whenever there are overlaps among the different requirements we might have. That means that an organization might be subject for different regulations and for different regulators for common aspects. It means that a break of one aspect might put you under the scrutiny of multiple regulators or entities in the area. And then you have not only the local aspects, but then you have the multi-jurisdiction impact when your operations are across the world and across different jurisdictions, and if they adopt either similar or in sometimes even contradictory approaches to these different areas, that can create quite a complex environment. I always think about the most common analogies, the data privacy. You have GDPR, starts with you, but then each region adopted their own regulations. Some of them align, others don't, and we need to keep track of all the different requirements across the different jurisdictions. And now it feels like security, physical security, health and safety will be facing a similar challenge. So
100%.
Definitely harmonization, simplification would be greatly desirable in the future.
I think just to give that context, the situation we have now in safety and security, excuse me, in terms of the regulators that can have a part to play, we have the Health and Safety Executive, you might have the Environment Agency, fire authorities who have their own localized primary authority relationships with businesses. You have local authorities who also have a similar approach, building safety regulator, and the SIA who are dealing with security risks. So, I mean, there's a lot of regulators to deal with, and the regimes don't always overlap.
So we're running a little bit short on time, but I really do not want to get fined or convicted of various crimes in various countries. Kizzy, who really needs to do what?
Well, that's a loaded question. But I mean, the idea of who is a duty holder, I think in short, are the business owners, the employers, the occupiers of buildings, those that manage and control spaces and activities, or supply offerings. I think those are the people that really need to know whether or not they have a personal responsibility or a part to play as part of the wider corporate. There's a lot of confusion. It doesn't even matter if you have HSSEQSS in your title. It's actually what the regulators look at is what you do. So what's the scope of your services and what's actually expected of you. There's also this idea that as individuals, whether you're a manager, a director, a consultant, an advisor, you also have some corresponding responsibilities and duties to meet. So I think it's almost the answer to the question is everybody may well have some sort of responsibility or duty that they can play a part in.
So all of these things, physical security, cyber security, health and safety, and all the rest of them, they all have a risk-based approach or can follow a risk-based approach. What does that mean in reality, Francisco?
Right, so well said. In most organizations, we have finite resources, being people, money, tools, whatever we can use. And so we need to figure out where we should be focusing first and apply the finite resources that we have available to us. And that's where a lot of time the risk-based approach comes, because we need to focus on what's more relevant in each area. And all these different areas, eventually will have an approach to risk to figure out where they should be focusing first, what they should be doing. And then we just discussed that there's a bunch of overlaps between all the different disjoint security related functions areas. with them perceiving risks slightly different, but those risks also span across the responsibilities of the different areas. So I would go back to the converged approach I talked before, and I don't expect them to follow the same risk approach because it's just not doable or not applicable for most organizations, but they need to enable communication across these security function leaders. I think they need to engage with upper management and discuss what convergence of risk approaches might look like for each organization. What does it make sense for them? And one of the key steps we always advise is maybe establish what we call convergence team, identify the key players like cyber security officer, the CISO, the one responsible for physical security, facility managers, IT, health and safety, and get them a forum where they can communicate and start drafting what that looks like, so that when risk is then passed on to upper management, it already brings about the best of each part in a working manner, instead of having a conflict of perspectives.
Well, before closing, and just to bring it home to everyone in the audience, Kizzy, what's the risk to us? We joked about fines. I joked about fines earlier. Are they real?
100% are real. And hopefully if people on the call will permit me for the next minute or so, just to give you the war stories of the reality of what things look like in the safety world and how that is transgressing into the security world. Penalties generally for companies and individuals are unlimited fines and imprisonment for some individuals, albeit I've heard today that the prosecution of individual directors and managers is on the decrease, but it's still a risk, and it's still a real risk. So, this year we've had big prosecutions. Large waste recycling company fined 3 million for a tragic accident in relation to the decommissioning of a gas rig, but that was really all around the failure to properly assess risks. And that is what led to inadequate safety measures. Similar example, NHS hospital last year, again, fined I think it was 600,000 for failing to manage the physical safety of staff and patients in relation to patients who were prone to incidents of violence and aggression, and that resulted in serious injuries. And if you think that individuals escape, they don't, because you have very often company secretaries. So we had an example a couple of years ago who was imprisoned for 8 months for a breach of health and safety legislation, disqualified from being a director for 7 years, all in relation to a failure to ensure that tasks were carried out safely, didn't provide first aid to an employee, didn't send them to hospital, and neglected in their legal duties to inform the HSE of breaches of security and safety. And the reason we have all of that is because we have sentencing guidelines in the UK to provide some sort of consistency, but a lot of the times for large organisations that have a turnover of about 50 million or more, you're looking at £1 million fines each time there is a breach. So that's the financial penalty, but you have alongside that the reputational risk of having to disclose a health and safety issue or a breach of security issue, and the loss of contractual relationships. Having to disclose these kind of breaches and failures can really damage the relationships that you've worked so hard to build.
Thank you. I think we've highlighted why this is such an important topic. I think it's really clear. Just to close, as we are out of time, if anyone would like to get in touch with the panelists, as mentioned earlier, you can get the bios and details in the section below on Zoom, and really appreciate everyone joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.